Hello, Worcester Mennonite Church, and welcome to week 25 in God's story of grace. This week, we are going to be talking about the parable of the vineyard. And in order to do that, we are going to trace several readings from the Old Testament, Isaiah chapter 5 and Psalm 80, all the way through this parable, which appears in Mark 12, Matthew 21, and Luke 20 in the New Testament, all the way through to John 15, where the imagery in the parable takes on a new meaning and new significance. So let's jump in. Well, to get started, the first thing we have to start with is the original image that comes to us in Isaiah chapter 5, which is actually a song of lament. And it is written from the perspective of God's lament for having created this beautiful vineyard with all these good conditions for the fruit of the vineyard to be turned into wine and to produce. And so he clears away rocks and he plants a good, beautiful vineyard. He also establishes a watchtower and he puts a hedge around the vineyard and he even installs a wine press. All this he does before he invites Israel, who represent the vineyard, to come forth and produce fruit. And so God has created all these conditions that are ideal for growth and flourishing, and he waits. And then the fruit that comes forth from this vineyard, which represents, as we said earlier, the people of Israel, and the fruit in Isaiah is here meant to represent covenant faithfulness and righteousness, applying God's laws and what he's calling the people to do. And so when reading it in that light, the fruit that comes forth is sour and poor and not of good quality. And so God is frustrated and disappointed because he put all the conditions in place for flourishing, and his vineyard, the people of Israel, have yielded this sour fruit because they haven't been able to respond to his gifts and his faithfulness and his love with good fruit, but instead they haven't been faithful. They haven't honored God back. So the song is lamenting this from Isaiah 5, and then it goes on to talk about God's judgment. God takes away the hedge of protection from around the vineyard. God no longer lets the rain fall down on the vines in the vineyard, and it is an expression of his disappointment. And then we shift from Isaiah 5 to Psalm 80, which is also a song of lament. We're told it's the song of Asaph. And as we go through this psalm, we see it's from the perspective of the people now. And it uses a similar language of a vineyard. But now, instead of God lamenting the people's unfaithfulness, the people are beseeching God for restoration. And so it's this kind of song of lament, inviting and hoping and asking for God to restore the vineyard and the vines in the vineyard. And so one interesting thing about Psalm 80 is that we hear about a son. We hear there's this call for restoration, and then there's this acknowledgement, God, you will raise up a son, and that this Son of Man, this figure, will be part of this hope for restoration and this work of renewal in the vineyard. So it kind of sets the stage for the parable of the vineyard that we have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So let's go ahead and shift from the Old Testament context into the New. And one of the things that we'll say, just to get started, is to recognize that Matthew, Mark, and Luke each have accounts of this because they often tell stories in a very similar way, as opposed to how things are presented in John, which often has a slightly different perspective. And because of that, the way that these three Gospels narrate in a similar way and have a similar perspective, they're called the synoptic Gospels, which there are two parts to that word. The first part, syn, like in the word synonymous, meaning the same or shared or common. And then optic, the second part, dealing with seeing and sight, like we think of an obstetrician or the optics of something. So the synoptic gospels are those that see together. They have a similar perspective and they bring them alongside each other. Well, they will narrate the story for us where Jesus, during Holy Week, after he's cleansed the temple and it's getting closer to the time where they'll celebrate the Passover and he knows he'll be arrested, he shares this parable of the vineyard with the religious leaders in mind who were there in his audience. And these are the main points that he says. So once again, he will build off of what we've already heard from Isaiah in the Psalms. And he starts out and he says there was a landowner who had a vineyard. And he made an agreement with certain tenants that they could come in and they could work in his vineyard. And the expectation was that after a time that he could come back and receive some of the fruits of their labor. But these tenants, once they move into the vineyard, they don't share the fruits of their labor. They don't seem to be bearing fruit or gathering the fruit as the landowner had hoped. So he sends certain representatives to them to confront them about this. And they mistreat his representatives and abuse them. These representatives are not enough to change the hearts of these tenants. And so finally, the landowner thinks, well, if I send my own son, surely they'll respect him and he'll get a result and he'll get change from them out of this situation. And so he sends his own son. And as the tenants see the son coming, they say, look, this is the son of the landowner. He is the heir. If we kill him, then we can take possession of this land. And so they take the son out of the vineyard and they kill him. Now, the religious leaders who hear Jesus sharing this know that he is talking about them. And you might say, well, what in the parables indicates that? And so let's just real quickly make some connections here. So in Isaiah, the vineyard represented Israel originally, and Jesus is very much aware of the Old Testament imagery from Isaiah, and so he brings it into this parable, but he changes it slightly because if you remember in Isaiah, God's hope was that the people as a whole, as a vineyard, would bear good fruit, that fruit of covenant faithfulness and justice. But Jesus takes the parable and he focuses on the tenants, which are understood in this context as the religious leaders, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law. And Jesus, the implication is here that they've been given this responsibility to be in the vineyard, which we said from the Old Testament context is this kind of charge over the people of Israel. But these tenants their actions haven't produced good fruit. And in fact, God sent prophets to them. So now we're thinking the representatives that were sent to them are the prophets from the Old Testament that they rejected. They wouldn't listen to the messages of the prophets and return to this covenant faithfulness that God was calling them to. And now God has sent his own son, who Jesus is referring to in this parable and pointing directly to himself. He is the son who has been sent to share the message with them, to beseech them to return to faithfulness to God, who's the landowner. And what's more, Jesus says that you will reject the son. The tenants, he's saying in the parable, will reject the son and take him outside and kill him. And he's prophesying that in a way, this is a connection to what happens later in the Gospels where Jesus is taken outside the city and killed. And it's something that he's saying directly to the religious leaders. And it's in that moment that a number of them determine that they want to come up with a plan to have him arrested because his teaching is so troubling to them. But this really is setting into motion the events that are going to happen at the end of Holy Week when Jesus is arrested and taken outside the city and crucified. And then there's this pivot after kind of this critique of the religious leaders and this prophecy of what is going to happen to the son. There is this discussion of a stone, and he shifts a metaphor from the imagery of a vineyard now to this idea of a cornerstone and of a building. And Jesus says, though he was rejected by these religious leaders and by a number of people who were part of the people of Israel, God has always intended for him to become the central foundational piece, the cornerstone, what is so crucial to the structure and the stability of a building, to be a cornerstone for this new expression of God's kingdom and his people that is emerging through what Jesus is doing. And so he becomes the cornerstone, and for those who can accept him or reject him, it becomes this sign of stumbling and of judgment. And it's like they encounter the stone as something that critiques and challenges them, whereas those who receive him build upon him and are integrated into this great building. And so it's a way to kind of follow up the parable of the vineyard with saying that God desires for his leaders to come back and to be restored. He wants those tenants to bear fruit, but for those who can't accept Jesus' part in that, then Jesus is saying that there is this confrontation and they've chosen the wrong way. So God will do something different. He'll provide a different way for this building to be built. So I think we should now transition from our readings in the Synoptic Gospels to John, who takes this imagery and goes yet even further. And in this scenario, John talks about Jesus as a vine. And so it's gone from the point of Israel, the vineyard, to Jesus, the Son, bringing restoration to the vineyard, now to Jesus himself being a vine. And he's entered into, it's like an embodiment, so to speak, within himself of the people of Israel. And he has become that symbol of the vine. And then he speaks of his followers as branches. And whereas in the Isaiah passage, his people were called to bear fruit in terms of covenant faithfulness and justice, and I guess we could frame it in terms of following the law or the path that he had set out before him. Now Jesus reinterprets it in John's gospel as responding to his love and also sharing back love toward him and towards others. So Jesus says, abide in me and you will have life. And part of that life will be the love that his followers receive as they abide in him. And then they're to take that love and to share it with others. And that is almost an organic image of a vine giving nutrients to the branches. And then the fruit that the branches produce is an expression of this nutrition that flows through them and comes out an expression in the fruit off of the branches. And then Jesus talks about pruning in John 15. And, whereas in the Synoptic Gospels, we have the example of the rock, the cornerstone, which is like an expression of the idea of judgment or confrontation and accountability and before God. In John's Gospel, he recontextualizes this idea of God's judgment into the pruning. And so God will prune in order that the branches can be more fruitful. So there's something restorative in this pruning, that God engages in this activity so that the branches will be more capable and more able to bring forth fruit, which I think is a really encouraging image, that when God, in this passage, when God is confronting us and challenging us and calling for change, when he's pruning us, that the intent is that our lives could become more filled with his love and could be more fruitful as they're enlivened by this love flowing through us. So it's actually the correction is meant to help us flourish more and to be healthier. But then also the imagery leaves us with kind of a new vision, whereas in the old covenant, in Isaiah's context, there were the external realities of living out the law in terms of a person's life and their responses and their daily routines, how they followed the dietary restrictions or the intent of how they relate to their neighbors and on the old covenant law. But in the New Testament, in this John 15 vision, we have this much more internal relational picture where this connection with Jesus and that intimacy with Jesus fuels or is the center of our prayer life and our spiritual life with God, and it informs and infuses how we relate to other people. And so maybe, whereas in the Old Testament, the law maybe seemed like it worked from the outward to the inward, in this new covenant context, it seems to work from the inward to the outward, from that time spent with Jesus and abiding with him, then empowering us to live outwardly in love, in service to others. And in a way, it kind of mirrors the promise. I believe it was in Jeremiah or maybe Ezekiel, or perhaps both, of God creating a new heart in his people, and his law will be then written on their hearts, not just something externally observed, but it starts in a lot of ways with this internal change or transformation. And it's a beautiful image too, where as we've gone through the images of the vineyard, first for God's people, and then ultimately being brought into Jesus himself at the end as the vine. We've seen this movement from how they navigated their struggles and what they thought was most important, to at the end being reminded that relationship connection with God through Jesus and letting God's love flow through them is the greatest good and the most important part of their faith. So it's a beautiful movement and inspiring image of how the spiritual life is centered on and grounded in God's presence and God's divine life through Jesus the Son. So I want to thank you very much for taking time to watch this video and reflect with me on these readings from this past week. I look forward to Sunday when we'll have an opportunity to process this a little bit further together. And I hope that you'll share your own thoughts with me, with others in Bible studies at the church or fellowship groups or Sunday school. And until next time, goodbye.